The day I decided to pretend I was broke wasn't the day I lost money. It was the day I started discovering who around me valued it more than they valued me, because when you remove comfort, when you strip away the image people have of your success, what's left isn't just truth. It's a version of reality most people never prepare themselves to face, and what I didn't expect, what I wasn't fully ready to accept, even after everything I had seen in my life, was that the person I was about to call family would reveal himself faster than anyone else, not through words. Not through confrontation, but through something far more telling, his behavior when he believed there was nothing to gain. My daughter had always been careful with her choices. At least, that's what I believed. She wasn't impulsive. She didn't make decisions lightly, and when she introduced him to me, there was a sense of confidence in her voice that made me think she had already seen everything she needed to see. But experience has taught me something different. It's taught me that people don't always reveal their true nature when things are stable, when everything looks secure. They reveal it when stability is questioned, when the future isn't guaranteed, and that's exactly what I needed to test, not because I doubted her, but because I understood something she didn't yet understand. The plan itself wasn't complicated. It didn't require elaborate setups or dramatic changes. It required something much simpler. Consistency, because pretending to be poor isn't about saying it. Once it's about living it, convincingly enough that no one questions it, and that meant changing details. Most people wouldn't think about adjusting how I spoke about work, where I spent my time, even how I responded to conversations about money, because the smallest inconsistency can break an illusion faster than any direct contradiction. At first, nothing seemed out of place. His behavior remained respectful, controlled, even slightly cautious, as if he was still evaluating the situation, trying to understand where I stood. And that initial phase is important, because it shows how someone behaves when they're unsure, when they don't yet have enough information to make a decision about how to treat you, and during that time everything appears balanced, neutral, almost reassuring. But that balance doesn't last once clarity begins to form. The shift started subtly, not in what he said, but in how he said it. The tone, the pauses, the slight hesitation before certain responses, and those are the details most people overlook because they're easy to dismiss as normal variation. But when you're paying attention, when you're actively observing rather than assuming, those small changes begin to form a pattern, one that tells you far more than direct statements ever could. He began asking different kinds of questions, then not directly about money, but around it, about stability, about long-term plans, about what the future might look like, and while those questions might seem reasonable on the surface, it's the intention behind them that matters, the way they're framed, the direction they're leading toward, because questions aren't just about gaining information. They're about confirming expectations. My answers were consistent, grounded in the version of reality I had created, not exaggerated, not overly dramatic, just enough to establish a clear picture that I wasn't in the position he might have assumed, and that clarity is what changes everything. Because once someone believes they understand your situation, they adjust their behavior accordingly, often without realizing it. That's when the distance began to appear, not physically at first, but emotionally, in the way he engaged, the way conversations felt slightly less invested, slightly more calculated, and that kind of shift doesn't happen without reason. It's a response, a reaction to new information that doesn't align with previous expectations, and when expectations change, so does effort. My daughter didn't notice it immediately, or maybe she chose not to, because sometimes it's easier to maintain a belief than to question it, especially when that belief is tied to something as important as a future together. But I noticed not because I was looking for flaws, but because I was looking for truth, and truth doesn't always present itself clearly. It reveals itself in patterns, in consistency over time, and as those patterns continued to form, as the small changes became more frequent, more defined, one thing became clear in a way it hadn't been before, that this wasn't just a test anymore. It was a process of uncovering something that had always been there, something that simply needed the right conditions to be seen, and those conditions were now fully in place. The change didn't arrive in a single moment. It wasn't something obvious enough to confront immediately. Instead, it unfolded gradually in layers that only became visible when viewed together, because behavior rarely shifts all at once. It adjusts in small ways that feel insignificant individually but reveal intention when they repeat, and that's exactly what began to happen. His tone lost a certain warmth. It once carried his engagement in conversations, became more selective, more measured. And while he still maintained a level of politeness on the surface, there was something underneath it now, something calculated, something that suggested he was no longer interacting with me as someone worth fully investing in. He started arriving later than before, not dramatically late, just enough to signal a change in priority. And while most people would brush that off as coincidence or circumstance, patterns don't lie, and this wasn't an isolated incident, it became consistent. A quiet adjustment that reflected a shift in how much importance he placed on being present. Because when someone values a relationship, they protect their time within it. But when that value decreases, time becomes flexible, optional, something that can be adjusted without concern for how it's perceived. Conversations began to feel different, too less balanced, less genuine, as if he was no longer speaking to understand, but speaking to maintain appearances. And there's a clear difference between those two. One is driven by interest, the other by obligation. An obligation has a limit. It only extends as far as necessary to avoid conflict, not to build connection. And that distinction became clearer with every interaction. He started making small remarks, subtle enough to avoid direct confrontation, but clear enough to carry meaning comments about stability, about how difficult things can be without proper planning, about the importance of being realistic about one situation. And while none of it was directed at me explicitly, the context made it obvious, because communication doesn't rely solely on direct statements. It relies on implication, on the space between words where meaning actually exists. What stood out wasn't just what he said, but when he chose to say it. The timing of those remarks often aligned with moments where my daughter wasn't fully engaged in the conversation, as if he was testing how far he could go without creating tension, and that kind of behavior reveals awareness. It shows that he understood the weight of his words, but still chose to express them when he believed there would be minimal consequence. His body language changed as well, something most people overlook, but often reveals more than words ever could: the way he sat, the way he responded. The subtle lack of attention when I spoke, all of it, pointed toward the same conclusion, that respect was no longer automatic. It had become conditional, tied to the version of me he now believed to be true, and once respect becomes conditional, it's only a matter of time before it begins to disappear entirely. There was a moment, small on the surface but significant in meaning, where he interrupted me mid-sentence, not aggressively, not in a way that demanded attention, but casually, as if what I was saying didn't carry enough weight to finish. And that's when it became undeniable, because interruptions aren't just about conversation, they're about priority, about who is given space and who isn't, and in that moment it was clear that my place in his perception had shifted. My daughter noticed it then, just briefly, a slight pause, a glance in my direction as if something didn't feel right. But she didn't address it, and that silence is important, because silence can either preserve comfort or allow truth to continue revealing itself, and in this case it allowed the pattern to continue uninterrupted, giving me exactly what I needed: a clear, consistent view of who he was becoming under these conditions. He became more open with his opinions after that, not directly confrontational, but less filtered, more willing to express thoughts that previously would have remained unspoken. And that shift is what happens when someone feels secure in their assessment of a situation, when they believe they fully understand where they stand and what they can say without consequence. And as all of these changes came together, as the small shifts formed a complete picture, one thing became impossible to ignore: that this wasn't temporary. It wasn't situational. It was revealing, showing a version of him that only existed when he believed there was nothing to gain, and that version, more than anything else, was the truth I had been waiting to see. By this point the shift was no longer subtle. It had moved beyond small inconsistencies into something more defined, more visible, something that didn't require close observation to detect, because when behavior changes consistently over time, It stops hiding in details and starts presenting itself clearly, and that clarity is what removed any remaining doubt I might have had, because doubt only exists when patterns are incomplete. But now the pattern was fully formed, every action, every tone, every decision aligning in a way that pointed to a single conclusion. He no longer made an effort to conceal his lack of interest in maintaining the same level of respect. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't openly dismissive, but it was present, consistent in the way he engaged, or rather, in the way he chose not to engage, because absence of effort can be just as revealing as direct action. And in many cases even more so, because it shows what someone does when they no longer feel the need to perform. Conversations that once included me, naturally, now seem to move around me, as if I were present physically but no longer relevant to the exchange, and that kind of exclusion isn't always intentional in the moment, but it stems from a deeper shift in perception, where someone is no longer seen as contributing value, and once that perception takes hold, it begins to influence behavior without conscious effort. There were moments where he would speak about the future, about plans, about decisions that would affect both him and my daughter, and what stood out wasn't just the content of those conversations, but the complete absence of any acknowledgement of my role within them, not even as a courtesy, not even as a formality. And that absence wasn't accidental. It reflected a belief, a quiet assumption that my position no longer required consideration. The tone he used when discussing stability became more direct as well, less subtle, less layered, almost as if he no longer saw a need to disguise his perspective. And that's what often happens when someone becomes confident in their assessment. They stop filtering their thoughts. They stop adjusting their words because they believe the environment supports their view, and in this case that environment was the version of me he had accepted as reality. What made it more revealing wasn't just his behavior toward me, but how that behavior contrasted with how he treated others in situations where there was something to gain because the difference was clear. The attention, the respect, the engagement all returned when value was present, and that contrast is what exposes intention more than anything else, because it shows that behavior isn't fixed, it's selective. My daughter began to notice more now, not in a way that led to immediate confrontation, but in small reactions, brief pauses, moments where something didn't feel aligned with what she believed, and those moments are important, because they represent the beginning of awareness, the point where perception starts to shift, even if it hasn't fully formed into understanding yet. He, however, remained consistent in his approach, almost unaware of how clearly his actions were defining him, because once someone settles into a belief, especially one that benefits them, they rarely step outside of it to evaluate how it appears to others, and that lack of self-awareness is often what allows patterns like this to continue long enough to become undeniable. There was a moment where everything aligned perfectly. A situation where his response, his tone, and the timing of his words all came together in a way that removed any remaining ambiguity. A moment that didn't need to be dramatic to be impactful, because its meaning was clear without exaggeration, and in that moment the test reached its true purpose. Not just observing behavior, but confirming it beyond question. And as that moment passed, as the final piece of the pattern settled into place, one thing became certain in a way it never had before, that this wasn't a misunderstanding, it wasn't situational, it was character. Revealed under conditions where he believed there was nothing to gain, and that realization carried a weight that couldn't be ignored because it didn't just affect the present, it defined what the future would look like if nothing changed. By now the tension wasn't hidden anymore. It lingered in every interaction, in every pause between sentences, in every glance that lasted just a second too long, because when truth begins to surface, it doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles quietly into the atmosphere, changing the way everything feels without immediately changing what is said. And that was exactly where we were, in a space where nothing had been directly confronted, but everything had already been revealed. I didn't rush to address it, not because I was unsure, but because timing matters more than reaction, and reacting too early can disrupt a pattern before it fully exposes itself. And I needed that pattern complete, undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as a misunderstanding. Because once something is confronted, it becomes easier for the other person to adjust, to correct, to hide again. And I wasn't interested in seeing a corrected version of him. I needed to see the real one in its entirety. He, on the other hand, had grown more comfortable, more settled into the version of reality he believed in, and that comfort showed in ways that were impossible to ignore now, in the way he spoke more freely, in the way he no longer measured his tone as carefully, in the way his words carried a subtle edge that hadn't been there before. And that edge wasn't aggressive, it wasn't openly disrespectful, but it carried something else, something quieter, something that suggested he had already made a judgment he no longer felt the need to question. There were moments when he would speak about financial decisions, about investments, about long-term security, and while those topics weren't unusual, the way he positioned himself within them had changed, as if he now saw himself as the one guiding, the one responsible, the one who needed to ensure stability, and in that positioning there was an absence. A noticeable lack of acknowledgement that I might still have a role, and that absence spoke louder than anything he could have said directly. My daughter felt it more clearly now, the difference between how things were and how they had become, and while she didn't fully understand the reason yet, she couldn't ignore the shift anymore, because when behavior changes consistently, it creates friction, even if the cause isn't immediately identified, and that friction began to show in her reactions, in the way she questioned certain comments, in the way she paused before responding, as if she was trying to reconcile two versions of the same person. I remained consistent, unchanged in the role I had created, because breaking that consistency even slightly could undermine everything, and more importantly, it could give him an opportunity to retreat, to adjust his behavior before the full truth had surfaced, and I wasn't going to allow that, because this wasn't just about testing him anymore, it was about understanding the depth of his character, how far it extended when he believed there was no benefit in maintaining appearances. Then came a moment that shifted everything further. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was careless, a comment made without hesitation, without the subtlety he had maintained before, a statement that revealed more than he likely intended, and what made it significant wasn't just what was said, but who was present when it was said, because this time my daughter heard it clearly, without distraction, without misinterpretation. The silence that followed wasn't long, but it was heavy, filled with something that hadn't been there before, awareness, and awareness changes everything. Because once someone sees something clearly, they can't return to not seeing it, and that moment marked the beginning of a shift, not just in how I viewed him, but in how she began to question what she thought she knew. He tried to move past it quickly, to redirect the conversation, to soften the impact of what had been said, but it didn't land the same way anymore, because once a pattern is recognized, individual moments stop being isolated. They become part of something larger, something that can't be easily dismissed, and the realization began to settle in quietly but firmly. And in that space where tension, awareness, and truth all existed together, one thing became inevitable, in a way it hadn't been before. That confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was a necessity, not driven by emotion, not fueled by anger, but by clarity, because once the truth is fully visible, ignoring it is no longer an option. The confrontation didn't begin with raised voices or dramatic accusations. It started quietly, almost deceptively calm, because real confrontation doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it enters a conversation as a simple question, one that seems ordinary on the surface but carries weight beneath it, and that's exactly how it began. My daughter asking him to clarify something he had said earlier, not aggressively, not emotionally, just directly, and that directness is what makes it difficult to avoid. Because when a question is clear, any attempt to deflect becomes obvious. He hesitated just for a moment, but that moment was enough to reveal that he understood the shift that had just taken place, that this wasn't another casual conversation where his words would pass without scrutiny. This was different, and that difference created pressure. Because pressure forces decisions. It forces people to either stand by what they've shown or attempt to reshape it before it's fully acknowledged. His response was measured, controlled, carefully constructed to soften the meaning of what had been said earlier. But there's a flaw in trying to revise something that has already been heard clearly, because revision doesn't erase the original. It only adds another layer to it, and that layer often reveals intent more clearly than the initial statement, because it shows what someone is trying to protect. My daughter didn't accept it immediately, not because she was looking for conflict, but because something no longer aligned. And when alignment breaks, it creates a need for clarity, a need to understand whether what was said reflects a moment or a mindset, and that distinction matters. Because a moment can be explained, but a mindset is much harder to justify. I remained silent at first, not disengaged but intentional, allowing the conversation to unfold without interference, because inserting myself too early would shift the focus. It would turn something that was naturally developing into something influenced, and I needed it to remain natural, because only then would the responses be genuine, unfiltered, and revealing in a way that couldn't be dismissed later. The pressure began to build then, not dramatically, but steadily. As each response required another, as each explanation led to another question. And that's how real tension forms, not through a single explosive moment, but through a series of smaller ones that leave less and less room to move, less space to avoid, until eventually. The only option left is to confront what's actually there. His tone shifted again, slightly sharper now, not openly defensive, but no longer as controlled as before, because maintaining control requires confidence, and confidence begins to weaken when consistency is challenged. When someone is forced to explain behavior that they never expected to be questioned, and that shift, however small, marked the beginning of something deeper. There was a point where he redirected the conversation toward practicality, toward logic, attempting to frame his perspective as reasonable, as grounded in reality rather than perception. And that's a common approach, because framing something as logical can make it seem justified even when the underlying motivation isn't, but logic without consistency doesn't hold, and that inconsistency was already visible. My daughter noticed that too. The gap between what he was saying now and how he had been acting over time, and that realization created something more powerful than doubt. It created recognition, because once someone sees a pattern clearly, they don't need it. Explain to them, they understand it instinctively. And that understanding changes how every new response is interpreted. And as the conversation reached that point where explanations were no longer aligning with behavior, where pressure had removed the space to deflect or reshape one thing, became unavoidable. That this confrontation was no longer about a single comment or a single moment. It was about everything that had led to it, every shift, every pattern, every choice that had revealed who he truly was when he believed there was nothing to gain. The moment truth begins to surface. It doesn't arrive all at once. It breaks through in fragments, in realizations that connect faster than words can keep up with, and that's exactly what happened, as the conversation reached a point where explanations no longer held their shape, where every attempt to justify only revealed more inconsistency, more gaps, more evidence that what we were seeing now wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a reflection of something that had been there all along, waiting for the right conditions to reveal itself. He tried to regain control of the narrative, then shifting his tone, softening his words, attempting to return to the version of himself that had once seemed reliable. But timing matters, and once a pattern has been recognized, reverting back doesn't restore trust. It only highlights that the behavior was flexible all along, adjusted based on what he believed the situation required, and the realization carries more weight than any single mistake ever could. My daughter's perspective shifted visibly now, not in a dramatic reaction, but in something more significant. The way she listened, the way she processed each word without immediately accepting it, because once trust is questioned, it changes how information is received. It introduces a layer of analysis that wasn't there before, and that layer makes it much harder for inconsistencies to go unnoticed. There was a pause longer than any before, and in that silence everything that had been building found its place, because silence allows truth to settle. It removes distraction. It gives space for recognition to fully form, and in that moment it became clear that this wasn't just about what had been said or done. It was about what it meant, about what it revealed when viewed as a whole. That's when I spoke not loudly, not emotionally, but with clarity. Because clarity doesn't need intensity to be effective. It needs precision, and every word I chose was deliberate, not to accuse, not to escalate, but to connect the pattern, to place each piece where it belonged, so that what had been developing over time could no longer be seen as separate moments, but as a complete and undeniable picture. His reaction wasn't immediate, and that delay said more than any response could have, because when someone is confronted with something they didn't expect to be seen, their first instinct isn't always to respond, it's to process. To understand how much has been revealed, how much is understood, and what options remain, and in that moment it was clear that he was realizing the extent of what had just been uncovered. He attempted to explain again, but this time the structure wasn't as strong. The confidence behind his words had weakened, because explanation requires a stable foundation, and that foundation had already been disrupted, and without it even the most carefully chosen words begin to lose their effectiveness because they no longer align with what has already been seen. My daughter didn't interrupt this time. She didn't question immediately. She simply listened. But the way she listened had changed. There was distance now, a separation between what was being said and what was being believed. And that separation is where trust begins to break, not suddenly, but steadily, as each new piece of information is measured against what has already been revealed. And then came the shift he didn't see coming, not in tone, not in words, but in control, because until that moment he had been operating under the assumption that he understood the situation, that he knew where everyone stood, but that assumption was about to collapse because what he believed to be true was only a fraction of reality, and that fraction was about to be replaced with something far more complete. I didn't reveal everything, yet not all at once. Because truth delivered too quickly can lose its impact. It needs to unfold in a way that allows each realization to land fully, to be understood before the next one arrives. And as I prepared to shift the conversation further, one thing became certain: that the balance of power in that room had already changed. He just hadn't realized it yet. There's a specific kind of silence that exists right before everything changes, not empty, not calm, but heavy with realization that hasn't fully landed yet. And that's exactly what filled the room as I looked at him, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with something far more unsettling certainty, because once you reach a point where doubt no longer exists, where every piece of behavior has aligned into a clear and undeniable truth, there's nothing left to question. Only something left to reveal, and what I was about to say wasn't just going to challenge his understanding of the situation, it was going to dismantle it entirely. I began slowly, not with a direct statement, but with context, because truth, when built properly, doesn't need to be forced. It needs to be understood, and I walked him through the pattern, every shift, every detail, every moment that had seemed small on its own but carried weight when placed together, and as I spoke I watched his expression change, not dramatically, but enough to show that he was starting to recognize the structure of what I was saying, that he was beginning to see himself from a perspective he hadn't considered before. Then I said it not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that there was no space for misinterpretation. That none of this had been accidental, that the version of me he believed to be true had been intentional, constructed, maintained over time for a reason, and that reason was him not to deceive without purpose, but to understand without interference, to see who he would become when he believed there was nothing to gain from maintaining respect. The reaction was immediate. This time not in words, but in presence, in the way his posture shifted, in the way his focus sharpened, because realization doesn't always need explanation. Sometimes it arrives fully formed, the moment the missing piece is revealed, and that was the moment he understood. Not just what I had done, but what it meant, that every decision he had made, every adjustment in behavior, had been observed, measured, and remembered. I didn't stop there, because stopping would have softened the impact, and impact was necessary not for punishment, but for clarity. And I explained what he had shown, not accusing, not exaggerating, but stating it as it was, that his respect had been conditional, that his engagement had been tied to perceived value, and that when that value appeared to disappear, so did his effort. And there's no way to reframe that once it's seen clearly. My daughter didn't speak immediately, and that silence carried more emotion than any reaction could have, because what she was processing wasn't just his behavior. It was the difference between who she believed he was and who he had revealed himself to be, and that kind of realization doesn't create immediate anger. It creates something deeper, a quiet understanding that changes everything moving forward. He tried to respond. Of course he did. Attempting to explain, to recontextualize, to present his actions as misunderstood rather than intentional, but there's a point where explanation no longer changes perception, where too much has already been seen, too many patterns recognized, and this was that point, where words could no longer outweigh behavior. Then came the part he wasn't prepared for, the final shift, the part that moved this from revelation to consequence, because understanding truth is one thing, facing the outcome of it is another, and I made it clear again, without emotion, without hostility, that decisions like these don't exist in isolation. They define trust, they shape relationships, and once that trust is broken, it doesn't return to what it was before. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't need to, because the weight of what had been revealed carried enough impact on its own. And, as I stood there looking at both of them, one processing the truth she had just seen, the other realizing the position he had placed himself in, one thing became undeniable, that this wasn't just a test he had failed, it was a reflection of a mindset that couldn't be ignored. Because, in the end, this was never about money, it was never about wealth or status or perception. It was about something far more fundamental, something people often overlook until it's too late. Respect isn't proven when there's something to gain, it's revealed when there's nothing left to take.